Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Dr. Jessica Gardner, the University Librarian for Cambridge, and I'm really delighted to welcome everybody here this evening, online, hello, and in person, to the first of this year's Sandars Lectures. The Sandars Readership in Bibliography is without question one of the most prestigious honorary posts to which book historians, librarians, and researchers can be appointed. The Sandars Readership was instituted in 1895 with a bequest of £2,000 left to the university by Mr. Samuel Sandars of Trinity College. Thank you, Mr. Sandars. We are still so grateful for your gift today. And it continues, of course, in the prestigious annual lectures dedicated to Sandars' name. Welcome, everybody, this evening. Now, just before I introduce this year's Sandars reader, Dr. Timothy Young, I hope you'll forgive me if I take a moment to remember a previous Sandars reader, Dr. Will Noel. Will gave the Sandars lectures in 2019, and he tragically died earlier this year in April 2024 at the untimely age of 58. With the permission and support of Will's family and this year's Sandars reader, we'd like to dedicate this year's lectures in his memory, in recognition of his outstanding contribution to the field and to Cambridge. Will completed his undergraduate and graduate studies at Cambridge, and he spent most of his career in the United States. Yet he retained a deep and abiding affection for Cambridge, for its people and its collections. He was truly honoured, and I'm told not a little apprehensive, when he was invited to deliver the Sandars Lectures in 2019. That was, of course, in front of an audience containing so many of his friends, his former colleagues, and former teachers, some of whom are also here this evening. He gave us 3 brilliant lectures in 2019 on the medieval manuscript and on the digital image, which I'm glad to say were filmed and remain available to watch for all time. Will's erudition and passion for books and manuscripts, and for frankly connecting people to collections and opening up access to them to wider audiences, they came across so strongly in those lectures and remain an inspiration to us all. Thank you. This year's Sandars reader is Dr. Timothy Young. Timothy is curator of rare books and manuscripts at the Yale Centre for British Art and has been there since 2023, but was previously curator of modern books and manuscripts at the Bibliography Library at Yale. His curatorial interests encompass British literature, modernism and avant-garde, literature and art, as well as children's literature, book art, printing and ephemera, LGBTQ and human sexuality, history, and the history of modern social and cultural movements. Drawing together many of those interests, the topic that Tim has selected for his Sandars Lectures in 2024 is resistance to bibliography. I can't wait. His 2 lectures tonight and tomorrow, and then followed by a masterclass for early career librarians and students on Thursday at the University Library, will draw on examples from the collections here to look at books that resist inquiry from readers, from scholars, cataloguers and historians. He has a beautiful description for his first lecture titled Isness and Aboutness as a meditation, isn't that gorgeous, on how bibliography functions and how we think about that practice today, with a focus on the work of interrogating books to discern what they meant to do in the world. This discursive talk from Timothy aims to expand bibliography beyond the steadfastly descriptive and analytical to the ludic, an approach that engages with books that, as he says, deceive slyly, lie boldly, and subvert our expectations. I just think that's wonderful and I can't wait. Following tonight's lecture, everyone who's present in this room, please come back with us to the University Library. We'd love for you to join us for a reception to raise a glass to Timothy. And also to celebrate the Sandars Lectures and to view some of the books that Timothy's going to discuss tonight. Right now, if I could invite you, Dr. Timothy Young, to give your first Sandars Lectures 2024, Isness and Aboutness.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks everybody for coming, and also everybody in the Cambridge University Library System and also the college library system. I've felt supported and inspired, and it's great to be here in the presence, the memory of all the former readers, especially Will Noel. let's get to the lecture. During the Second World War, in the dark years of 1942 and 43, a special category of books circulated in German military-occupied France. These included an almanac, a pocket dictionary, a tract on war damages, and a poetry anthology. These little books were designed to be unobtrusive, to hide in plain sight, because they were Tarnschriften, from the German, camouflaged or hidden publications. They were produced to carry information to resistance fighters in Germany and France. In the case of these 4 books, they were guides to sabotage, including instructions on how to disarm German vehicles. Interestingly, I haven't found a French equivalent for the term Tarnschriften. This may be because the majority of them were produced by the Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands, the KPD. However, as indicated by a note in the pocket dictionary, it was diffusé par le Parti Socialiste Clandestin, and all 4 of these French Tarnschriften have identical text blocks that begin with an introduction stating, La résistance passive des civils aux exigences allemandes n'est plus suffisante. En raison des méthodes apportées par les Allemands dans la conduite de la guerre, il faut que la lutte des populations civiles entre dans une phase active. Translation, passive resistance by civilians to German demands is no longer sufficient. Due to the methods introduced by the Germans in the conduct of the war, the struggle of the civilian population must enter an active phase. I suppose that the makers of these books depended upon their size, generic presentation, and military personnel's lack of knowledge of French to remain undetected. In 2012, I was able to bring to Yale University this group of the 4 little books you saw. I found them intriguing, first for their historical importance, but also because they provoked questions about bibliography. I was trained as a librarian with a double focus: archives and rare books. I had the luck of having been in school when bibliography was still actively taught, along with excellent training in archival work. As I progressed to the professional ranks of librarianship, however, I found myself thinking much more about books rather than archives. Why? One worries about archives and one thinks about books. Books became more of a theme for me during my 21 years working as curator for modern books and manuscripts at Beinecke, Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I was tasked with understanding an existing collection of books, roughly 500,000, falling in the broad areas I stewarded, understanding how they had been used for research over the centuries of Yale's existence, conceptualizing their future potential for use in the always evolving landscape of research, academic and general interest investigation, and particularly selecting books to add to the collection to both support and broaden this work. I admit to being possessed of a nature that wants to understand the world by categorizing it 1 volume at a time, and I enjoy bibliographic challenges. The basic challenge with bibliography is that the word means different things to different audiences. Bibliography can mean a list of works on a subject, a reference list or canon, if you will, an activity for describing a book, metadata, a process for describing the materiality or structure of a printed book, collation and its other evolved forms. It can be an in-depth account of the genesis of a text, analysis, or can also be an accounting of all versions and variants of a book, a census. To support this range of meanings, we rely on training, standardization of practice, and bodies of established terminologies. In other words, systems of control. Bibliographers and librarians especially have a fraught relationship with this concept. Bookwork can be seen as the most liberal of pursuits, but it requires, for the most part, reliance on systems of control, vocabularies, formulas, measurements, even color charts, like the centroid chart, which is used to establish color names for book binding cloth. Bibliography is a practice that supports canons and is built on notions of value, connoisseurship, and importance. Therefore, it is not surprising that these concepts provoke resistance. Thus, a perfect point of departure is Tarnschriften, books literally created by a resistance movement. They make me realize that any time I hold a book in my hand, I'm driven to ask, what is your real name? Where are you from originally? And crucially, what do you think you're doing? All these questions, not by chance, carry the resonance of interrogation. The more vexing, obscure, confusing, and confounding a book is, the more questions we find ourselves asking. We will address three forms of resistance to bibliography. Resistance by books, resistance by us, the makers and users, writers, bibliographers, and librarians, and resistance to bibliography as a spur for evolving practice. So first, resistance by books. How do certain books present themselves as resistant? We should start by asking, what do we want from a book? Data, information, solace, confirmation, entertainment perhaps. So we ask a book to identify itself. And books have many forms of ID: title page, copyright page, ISBN, book plate, call number, genre tag, security marks, etc., etc. And most carry multiple forms of ID. But can we trust them? Books resist our inquiries in many ways. The most common of these are being coy about authorship, although through the use of what we generally call pseudonyms. This is a topic that has merited much investigation, so there's no need to go into a long discourse. We know the most often used types: pseudandry, like George Sand; work for hire, Carolyn Keene in the mystery novel; collective authorship, Ellery Queen. But the excellent 1868 reference work, Handbook of Fictitious Names, provides a wonderland of additional forms of authorial disguisement. In the A section alone, we encounter ironyms, initialisms, geonyms, disguised authors, titlonyms, apocryphs, phrenonyms, prenonyms, pseudotitlenyms, phrenodemonyms, phrasonyms, and enigmatic initialisms and supposed authors. I will leave it to the reader to venture down this rabbit hole, or vice versa, of obscure nyms. For the record, this volume is attributed to Olfar Hampst, Esquire, pseudonym, which is an anagrammatization for one Ralph Thomas. Books resist by misstating publication data, that is, false imprints. Again, a well-known subject that can be tidily epitomized with a single example of Pierre du Marteau and Son, a fake bibliographic dynasty invented by Dutch printers to avoid trouble in the 17th century. Here is La Memoria della Signora Duchessa Mazzarini, printed in Colonia by the Appresso Pietro del Martello, 1677. Pietro del Martello being, of course, the Italian rendering of this name. In the Cambridge University Library catalog, we find a truly fabulous tracing for a related book. Pierre du Marteau, imaginary printer. There are also problems with dates on books, but we'll reserve that for tomorrow and we'll take a deep dive. Books resist when they seek to avoid censure because they are heretical, they expound on popular opinions, or are published under threat of retribution. I think we may gaze upon the frontispiece of the 1711 edition of the list of the Vatican's prohibited books that shows what happens to such heretical publication. But don't worry, neither St. Peter nor St. Paul were harmed in the making of this picture. Books resist because they are lewd or obscene, such as Tijuana Bibles, a genre that was clandestinely published in the United States, likely in New York or New Jersey, but with imprints that indicated they originated from other locations, one devoid of morals, such as Tijuana, Mexico, or in this case, London. Popeye gets it, or the sailor gets it French style. That's the only page I'm allowed to show right here. Books resist because they are piracies, counterfeits, or unauthorized editions, such as the 1613 version of the Essays of Sir Francis Bacon Knight, one of the 3 editions published that year rising from a feud between 2 copyright claimants. I consulted the Standard Bibliography for Bacon by R.W. Gibson, published in 1950, to learn the details of and reasons for doubt about the 1613 essay collections. but was stymied upon reading that he explicitly excluded, do this, I can't make it larger, bastard copies. Luckily, I found Michael Kiernan's essay on the order and dating of 1613 editions of Bacon's essays, published in the library in December 1974. And if anyone here is thirsting for the taste of meaty bibliographic work, that essay will surely satisfy with its smoking guns in the form of ornamental and factotum initials, shaded arabesques, and blemishes on left-hand descenders. I mean this with all respect. Intensive examination of printed letter forms can be quite fulfilling. Books resist because they are parodies. This memoir, My Royal Past by Baroness von Bülow, née Princess Theodora Louise Alexina Ludmilla Sophie von Eckermann-Waldstein, as told to Cecil Beaton from 1939. A work about which a reviewer in the Manchester Guardian wrote, quote, "Here are revealed the sensational secrets which never shook the courts of Europe. Here we penetrate at last into the intimacies and confidences of royal families whose names were on nobody's lips." And books resist because they are fabrications, such as the 18th century parodic and libertine fairy tale by Claude Prosper Joliot de Crébillon, Tanzai et Néardenne, Histoire japonaise, indicated as having been published à Pékin, actually Paris, chez Lu Shu Shula, seul imprimeur de Sa Majesté chinoise pour les langues étrangères in 1740. The work was a satire on controversies around Catholic doctrine in France in the early part of the 18th century. The tale uses China merely as an allegorical setting for swipes at prominent persons involved in the debate. The 27-year-old author, however, was imprisoned at the Château de Vincennes following the scandalous publication of the book. Nevertheless, it started a genre of parodic literature that flourished for France in decades. Books resist because they're half disguised, a letter to the Right Honorable Lady V.S.V., occasioned by the publication of her memoirs in the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle. This letter, a chapter from Tobias Smollett's satire on manners, concerned the marital difficulties of real-life Vicomtesse Vane, and was probably written, at least in part, by Vane. Books resist because they want attention by the author of, used to generate continuing interest in an author's output. The 18th and 19th centuries are rife with examples. My favorite discovery in this category at CUL is this London imprint from 1622. If you can see it there, yet more work for a mass priest, published by the author of the other books. We might guess, like I did, that this phrasing was put into use because the author was either too busy or too exhausted to add their name to yet one more book. But that's not the story, of course. This obfuscation of authorship was in fact clarified in the foreword, in which the author of this work and a pair of previously issued anonymous pamphlets reveals his identity. Alexander Cook was a noted anti-Catholic polemicist who had been installed as the vicar of the Leeds Parish Church of England. He ran afoul of some prominent citizens of Leeds for his quote-unquote schismatical disposition. He wasn't tired. He was simply a 17th century clergyman caught up in a hyper-local tempest. Books resist because they don't want attention. The Book with No Name by Anonymous, a #1 bestseller that I seem to have overlooked. In Santa Mondegna, an unnamed book brings violent death to anyone who reads it. You can skip that. Or books resist because they are sui generis, such as this classic book, and I mean this, a very important book, Everything Gay Men Know About Gay Women, which consists of blank pages. The context for this book is layered. The item was donated to Yale by lesbian activists Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin LaHusen, who bequeathed copies of their books from their library to a number of institutions across the United States in 2007. It was really wonderful. A box arrived without a return address, and I found from other places that these women at the end of their lives divided up and made a box for almost every academic library across the US. It was a wonderful thing they did. So this book is not a product of a hostile political faction, nor of a snide comedian. It was published in 1968 in San Francisco by the Society for Individual Rights, an important group that made strides for gay visibility. However, the society was decidedly male-centric. Their magazine, Vector, while calling for political action, also featured foldouts of male nudes. The acronym of the group was, after all, was SIR. But on the rear cover of this little blank book, we find an additional note. For information on this subject, Lesbian Woman by Phil Lyon and Del Martin, a suggestion to the reader to seek out a book that knows something about gay women. Books pretend, they lie, they hide, they obfuscate, they prevaricate, they can be shy, coy, bold, brash, and sassy, like the humans that made them. Another form of bibliographic resistance comes from writers, bibliographers, and librarians, often because they hit a barrier of resistance in writing, in reading, or in their practice. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, the influential writer and theorist who laid much of the groundwork of what we know as queer theory, noted in her essay, "A poem is being written. Nothing, no form of contact with people of any gender or sexuality, makes me feel so simply homosexual as the evocation of library afternoons of dead-ended searches. Wild guesses that, as I got more experience, turned out to be almost always right. Why, when I asked the Britannica about the crime of Oscar Wilde, does it tell me about, quote unquote, offenses under the Criminal Law Amendment Act? Nowhere summarized. If information is being withheld, and to recognize even that is a skill that itself requires and gets development, must it not be this information? I don't know whether there can be said to be for our culture a distinctive practice of homosexual reading, but if so, it must surely bear the fossil marks of the whole array of evasive techniques by which the Britannica, the Reader's Guide, the wooden subject author and title catalogs frustrate and educate. Is it surprising to learn that Sedgwick, after seeing how her landmark book, The Epistemology of the Closet from 1990, had been classed by the Library of Congress, she wrote a letter to that institution to protest that it was not specifically about homosexuality in literature, but would be better classed in the more expansive categories of theory, philosophy, and aesthetics. For the record, in 2024, the work retains most of the original tracings assigned by the Library of Congress. I do note one in particular, Gay Men's Writings - History and Criticism - Theory, etc. Perhaps Sedgwick did get her intention honored in the form of a single word, belatedly. Thus, the legacy of an act of a gentle resistance from a writer. The ever-opinionated William Morris authored a short paper in 1893 for the Bibliographical Society in London titled The Ideal Book. His thesis posits utilitarianism vis-a-vis beauty. I'll quote, "By the ideal book, I suppose we are to understand a book not limited by commercial exigencies of price. We can do what we like with it, according to what its nature, as a book, demands of art." He goes on to attest that, quote, "A book quite unornamented can look actually and positively beautiful and not merely unugly." I find his view curious, for even as he appears to be discussing the externalities of the book, he takes a leap in introducing the concept of the nature of a book. For Morris, pointing to the nature of anything is never accidental. His statement imbues the book with a sort of organic agency, if you will, an object that has its own demands. In John Carter's perennially updated ABC for Book Collectors, the entry, "Follow the Flag," addresses disagreements between English and French bibliographers about what constitutes a first edition. Quote, "With a few reluctant exceptions, French bibliographers ignore the claim of such editions on the attention of the collector, avoiding the dilemma of chronological priority by the use of the term édition originale, which means not the first edition, but the first authorized edition published in France. English and American collectors have so far found no such convenient formula for reconciling logic with sentiment. Are we closer to the seat of resistance, logic versus sentiment? Carter gestures slyly to the heart of the matter, mind versus body, art versus craft. Another towering figure in the field, Donald Mackenzie, took a much more assertive position in his essay, Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts. This is long, but it's worth considering because he's a fantastic writer. Quote, if by contrast we are to delineate the field in a merely pragmatic way, take a panoptic view, and describe what we severally do as bibliographers, we should note rather that it is the only discipline which has consistently studied the composition, formal design, and transmissions of text by writers, printers, and publishers, their distribution through different communities by wholesalers, retailers, and teachers, their collection and classification by librarians, and their meaning for, and I must add, their creative regeneration by readers. However we define it, no part of that series of human and institutional interactions is alien to bibliography as we have traditionally practiced it. The principle I wish to suggest as basic as simply this. Bibliography is a discipline that studies texts as recorded forms and the process of their transmission, including the production and reception, in terms of the range of demands now made of it and of the diverse interest of those who think of themselves as bibliographers. It seems to me that it would now be more useful to describe bibliography as the study of the sociology of texts. This is not new to a lot of you, but I wanted to make sure that we included Mackenzie's thoughts. His resistance is to push outward, to expand the work of bibliography into a wider discipline. So 4 voices, arguing at, for, and around the book. Sedgwick for a better understanding of the intentions of the book's creator. Morris is all about the need for the book to be a beautiful object to be considered ideal, though he sees a possibility of self-determination. Carter unmasks the vulnerability of analytic work when feelings enter the debate. And Mackenzie orients our attention to the fact that books have social afterlives, as objects that generate new identities and meanings as they reach new and different audiences of readers. Testimonies of writers and bibliographers can be considered amicus briefs, expressing support for the work of bibliography, while noting forms of discontent when they encounter resistance. And now I push to the front of the barricade my peers and colleagues, those of us who work on bibliography from the inside, and who contend with systems, protocols, processes, and philosophies that frustrate us in subtle and obvious ways. I have a plan that for future talks I give to novice bibliographers and curators, I may well begin with this image of a catalog card for an item in the collection of the Yale Center for British Art, specifically this note at the first paragraph: the Adam work is a bibliographic nightmare. Anyone who has spent hours with uncooperative volumes will be familiar with the concept of the bibliographic nightmare and the range of reactions it evokes. When I entered library school, I was naively unaware that I was signing up for a career that would bring with it anxious waking dreams. Bibliography produces monsters. Another brutal truth comes from one of the most important voices in 20th century bibliography, Philip Gaskell, author of A New Introduction to Bibliography, written here in Cambridge in the 1970s. He asserts that bibliography is, quote, to serve the production and distribution of accurate text, and to do this, the work requires these skills, quote, to think logically, to judge critically, and to persevere in tediously repetitive tasks. Now that was something I did know before I went to library school, having worked in libraries since I was a child. But I was not aware when I was reading Gaskell that he was concerned with a focus form of the craft, namely analytic bibliography. This is to distinguish that part of work from standard bibliographic work, which can be simply the act of list making, as I mentioned up above. With sufficiently more skill added, it becomes cataloging a book, but still, nightmares and tedium. Why would anyone resist pursuing a career in book work? What lights the rocky path of bibliography is devotion, stamina, mentorship, and collegial support. And it doesn't hurt to collect talismans. I found mine in the second semester of library school. I encountered an image that kept my mind focused on the field I was preparing to join, and then at the same time gave me a sense of calm equilibrium. It's a picture by an illustrator named Sergei Volkov. and was featured in the 1991 book, The Irony Tower, Soviet Artists in the Time of Glasnost, edited by Andrew Solomon. I clipped it from the New York Times Book Review, and as you can tell by the inherent vice of lignin in the newsprint and the pinholes, I made sure it has been present in my line of sight for the past 3+ decades. Titled Order and Chaos, it is a bibliographer's version of the test given to an introductory art course when one views Titian's Sacred and Profane Love. Which figure is sacred? Which figure is profane? Which of these images is order and which of these images is chaos? The image for me points to the through line of the examples we've looked at and the commentaries we've heard. The tension between order and chaos is mirrored by what I see as the core goal of bibliography, the balance between isness and aboutness. Most forms of bibliographic work are primarily concerned with the former, isness, the goal of establishing identity, completeness, and accuracy through self-evident and comparative data. But what about the content of a book's creation, its connections and its continuities, its afterlife, the how and why of a book, the aboutness? It might do us good to shift some attention from what a book is to what a book does. How does it function in the world? So we have these dialectic pairs: order and chaos, logic and sentiment, beauty and ugliness, control and freedom, the mind-body problem. Does the body rule the mind or does the mind rule the body? I don't know. Isness and aboutness, thusness and suchness. Each pair is a source of vexation for us, the collectors, bibliographers, catalogers, and librarians who profess to love books, though we remain forever uncertain whether they love us back. Especially control and freedom. We prize the contents of a book as well as their externalities, as I said, their data and their metadata, but we're wary of applying systems of control in our age that is characterizable by a fog-like resistance to authority and the simultaneous triumph and failure of identity politics as embodied in many forms of human practice. How do we bring these opposing pairs closer together harmoniously? We need them in our ongoing work of bibliography because they present resistance that is ultimately generative. They create problems we're solving. We may not be able to distinguish the finger pointing at the moon from the moon itself, but we can catalog them both. A step toward conciliation is by way of a redefinition. Instead of control, we might prefer ordered liberty as a nuanced way to talk about bibliographic work. And I suggest this phrase in a simple non-political sense, a bibliographic practice that plots a path but is flexible. The days of the centroid color chart might be over, since protocols and dust jackets fade over time, but there remain good reasons for re-examining the core goals of bibliography. If we think about the group of books I selected to show bibliographic resistance, we see that most of them have nuanced context. These involve intentions behind the creation aligned with the meanings derived by readers, an audience that changes and evolves over time. Because one of my principal concerns as a working librarian is having data present in descriptive records of first discovery, I would like to have metadata that provides context for the resistant nature which might otherwise remain invisible. Around the same time that the Tarnschriften were being produced in Germany, a French artist was working through his own issues of identity. Jean Dubuffet, then in his early 40s, wrote about his work and life in a brief essay simply titled Notice, in a catalog of an exhibition of his lithographs and paintings at the Galerie André in Paris in April 1945. When looking at bibliographic records for this book, we can easily discover the essential isness, title, author, date. But records contain minimal aboutness. For the 5 copies of this catalog held by libraries in the United States, 3 of them have catalog records that include a single subject tracing, Dubuffet, Jean, 1901-1985 exhibitions. This little book is similar to the Tarnschriften, but has a torqued intention. The book declares its identity honestly, but catalogers and bibliographers have assumed that it is about one thing, an exhibition of artwork. Reading Dubuffet's essay, the aboutness comes into focus like a spectral emanation revealing itself. His notice to the visitor is an apologia for his life and work. He recounts in brief his two failed attempts to become an artist until his third plunge when, quote, everything fell into place. How did this happen? He began to see the extravagant, perhaps pointless richness of the world and asked, what if art was too ingrained, too aware of itself? Art supported by colleges, PhDs, judges, committees, starched shirts, powdered wigs, grim and austere looks. God, that would be the real fuck up. What if true art was more modest? Modesty, from the Latin modestus, keeping due measure, with due in the sense of careful. Modesty is the middle path between chaos and order, measuring chaos with care, concerned with order, but not controlling. This essay was included a year later with three other pieces by Dubuffet's writing, which if you've never read Dubuffet, read Dubuffet, in a collection called Prospectus aux amateurs de tout genre, prospectus for amateurs of all types, with a new title, Plus Modeste. Dubuffet's attenuated journey toward embracing joy in his work leads me to assert that it's time for a new branch of bibliography. We have enumerative, systematic, descriptive, analytic, textual, historical bibliography, others that I have not worked with. How about ludic, related to play, games, and puzzles? Sentimentally, I feel that resistant books demonstrate the innate potential for play. They are assumed to be fixed objects communicating, yet still oddly mute, but they are platforms for jokes, double meanings, drama. They simultaneously contain and are enveloped in rebuses and anagrams. Their contents do not have to match the conceit of their title pages to fulfill their promise. Ludic bibliography. If something is hiding, we should seek. If we're given clues, we should follow them. If we see a puzzle, we should try to solve it. Very well then, I've provided the flourish that was promised. The rhetorical panache waves gaily from my imaginary hat. But to use a phrase beloved by library committees around the world, what are my action items? How do we turn fizzy rhetoric into doable things? I don't have a foolproof vision, but I can offer a few suggestions. We should encourage the teaching of basic bibliography in undergraduate and graduate humanities education. I know that sounds radical, but I believe in it, especially for those doing book history and library science. We should consider the performative afterlives of books. Not easy, but it's worth doing. Bibliographic records in book catalogs or in bibliographies should provide contextual information for books that are resistant to identification, to give a little bit of a reason how we know what we know. And we should always do 2 glosses of a book in hand, looking at the physical item and examining the content, or actually maybe reading it, balancing the body and the mind of the book. Consider my talk a call for kindred thinkers out there who suggest their own ideas about what bibliography will mean in the next 10 years. We're a confident and smart bunch. I know we can come up with a plan together. To do so, we will need adequate patience for the task, and, to borrow a phrase I love from the theorist and writer John Stilgoe, we must learn to accept as a key part of our work countless corrections of course. Thank you.